Our main story tonight is realism. No, not the art style Salvador Dali just can't be bothered to use. I mean, come on, Salvador, that's not how clocks work. That's not how they work. No, in this case, realism is a theory of international relations. And I know that sounds like a boring at best, depressing at worst topic, but we need to discuss this. So I'll make you a deal. If you can sit through this piece, at the end I'll show an adorable clip of a sloth climbing playground equipment. And trust me, you are going to want to see it. So, realism, the oldest theory of international relations. It focuses on how the balance of power causes countries to engage with one another. This theory assumes that people and governments are self-interested and mainly concerned with gaining power. Basically, this theory believes that everyone is out for themselves and that nobody does anything before calculating its benefit. It's essentially the Hunger Games of theories. Realism considers that countries are the most important actors in international relations because there is no international system that can prevent a country from doing something. And I know what you're saying right now. You're saying, well, hold on a minute. What about the UN and Interpol? They can prevent countries from doing things. Well, yes, international organizations like the UN can restrict certain behaviors. They wouldn't be able to prevent, say, the US from invading Iraq, theoretically. The truth is, UN rules only go so far, and when a powerful country like the United States wants to do something, they can't do everything. Realism is gaining popularity as people around the world become disillusioned with their governments and start thinking power is the only thing their leaders care about. Man, I wonder what that's like. So, to investigate how realism views the world, let's use an example. And since my writers apparently want me to disappear, let's make that example Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. To understand this situation will require a bit of history, so here's the simplest possible version of the Crimean crisis. So, Ukraine, a country you know so little about you didn't realize that's not Ukraine, that's Ukraine. And that's Crimea. In 1783, Crimea became part of Russia, and it remained that way until the Cold War, when in 1954 its control was transferred to Ukraine. However, this mostly didn't matter, as Crimea was still controlled by the USSR. It was mostly a symbolic gesture, but it was the root cause of the Crimean crisis, which caused massive riots and Russia's removal from the G8. It's like if a couple released doves at their wedding, and the doves then shit on the cake, gave everyone food poisoning, and reignited Russia's anger towards the West. Anyway, when the Soviet Union dissolved and Ukraine gained independence in 1991, Crimea remained part of Ukraine, despite a majority of residents speaking Russian and identifying as ethnically Russian. Then, in 2013, the pro-Russia Prime Minister of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, refused to renew a trade agreement with the EU, which led to massive protests, eventually leading to Yanukovych's removal. At this point, Crimean leaders were flirting with asking Putin to invade and take over Crimea, and honestly, it's easy to see why. I mean, Putin doesn't pose shirtless constantly for no reason. Anyway, Crimea's wish came true on February 27th, when Russian special forces seized Crimean government buildings. This prompted the Ukrainian government to call for a referendum, which would determine whether Crimea would join Russia or agree to remain part of Ukraine under an outdated constitution. And if you've heard anything about Britain in the past 3 years, you might be able to guess what happened. In a vote described by some as complete bullshit, the results declared that 95% of Crimean residents wanted to join Russia. Shortly after their vote, Crimea declared independence and requested that Russia take control over it, which had to hurt Ukraine at least a little bit. Crimea essentially conducted a Twitter poll asking if it should get divorced, then split with its spouse to move in with the Russian bots that rigged the poll. But while Westerners generally blame Putin for this aggression, realists see the situation kind of differently. In the 2000s, NATO had been expanding east and trying to incorporate Ukraine into Western Europe. This posed a threat to Russia, who feared that westernizing Ukraine would decrease the control it had over the region. Putin himself said this about the annexation.
The decisions were taken behind our backs. This was the case with NATO expansions to the east, the siphoning of military infrastructure at our borders. And they say, oh, it has nothing to do with you. Well, what do you mean it has nothing to do with us? Having the military might of NATO on our borders.
Meanwhile, European leaders maintained that the Crimean annexation was unjustified and dangerous, with the Secretary General of NATO saying this.
Russia's aggression against Ukraine is the gravest threat to European security in a generation. And it challenges our vision of a Europe whole, free and at peace.
From a realist perspective, NATO had to take this position in order to rein in Russia for any future plans it might have to continue expanding west and to curtail its power on the international stage. It was essentially a power play designed to mitigate Russia as a threat. And with that, we now have to answer the question you simultaneously expected and hoped would never come. Is Donald Trump a realist? Well, first, it's worth noting how many realists the Trump administration has seemed close to, including Little Rocket Man Kim Jong-un, Jared's buddy Benjamin Netanyahu, and of course, Vladimir Putin. While it can be difficult to ascribe any coherent international policy to Donald Trump, many of his policies have shown the display of power commonly seen with realists, including his increased tariffs on Mexico and China, criticisms of NATO allies, and withdrawal of troops from Syria earlier this year. All these actions show a desire to maintain power and to constrain the power of other countries. Additionally, realism is often associated with nationalism and isolationism, which Trump has shown in his calls for ending illegal immigration and in pulling out of the Paris Agreement. And then there's this.
The campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, Norway, we have information on your opponent. Oh, I think I'd want to hear it.
You want that kind of interference in our elections?
It's not an interference. They have information. I think I'd take it.
This statement shows a clear desire to maintain power at any cost, which means we now either have a president whose only goal is to maximize his power, or we have a president who has no fixed beliefs about foreign policy, but keeps accidentally espousing realist beliefs. And I genuinely don't know what's worse. If you're now very sad about the state of this country, I frankly don't have anything to say to cheer you up, but I do have something to show you. Cue the sloths.
Ah!